Welcome back to Native Exiles, Alderwood Community Church's podcast, where we talk about following Jesus in the tension of being in the world, but not of it. And we are continuing our conversations, getting ready to have a series as a church around sexuality, Jesus, sex, and gender. And today in our conversation, Steve and I are going to get more deeply into one aspect of this conversation, which is the LGBTQ conversation. And thinking about, as a church, how do we think through these very complicated issues? How do we understand what the Bible's saying? How do we balance grace and truth? And it was a really helpful conversation for me. I hope it's helpful for you. Here we go. Well, Steve, I know I'm a little on edge heading into today's conversation. We're talking about LGBTQ topics and how we should think as Christians and what the Bible says. And it's an important conversation, but it's not an easy one.
No, Wyatt. It's not an easy one. And let me just commandeer. I'm going to hijack the opener here for just a minute because I asked you this question last time. I mean, you are a mere 8 months into your pastorate, and here you are tackling LGBTQ issues. I asked you last time, and you demurred on it. You said, well, I'm just doing this because I'm just dumber than I look. No, Wyatt, people want to know, are you trying to show us your woke credentials? Are you going to slide in some newfangled theology on us? What are we doing here, Wyatt?
Yeah, well, no, I'm certainly, I'm not dumb enough to come in 8 months and try to show my woke credentials. That's not what this is about at all. I think there's a number of things on my mind. I just really have a deep belief that Jesus matters for the deepest, most important things in our life, the hardest things, the most painful things, the most, contentious things. I just believe that if Jesus really is the creator of all things, and in all things, he holds them together and all things are for him, that it matters. And so if we're going to lead people to follow Jesus, we can't be afraid of the tough stuff. So that's one of the things is I think we have to be talking about the most controversial things. And this is certainly one of them. And it's not just controversial, but it's deeply personal.
Yeah, it is that. I mean, honestly, the other thing I was going to tease you about a little bit is I would just trying to increase our ratings here or something like that. But no, this is a deeply personal issue. You and I both know people that have struggled with this, that have people in their lives that are struggling with this. Almost everyone in our congregation is touched in some way by this. Yeah. Just last Sunday, Wyatt, you brought this up. And an older gentleman in our congregation, late 70s, came up and said, I am so grateful you guys are talking about this because my granddaughter was living a homosexual life for a long time, and she needed to hear this 10 years before she did.
Well, see, and that's the thing is I think there's part of my job, part of our job as pastors is to equip our people to follow Jesus, to do the work of the ministry, to be salt and light in their communities. And we desperately need help here. We need help on how to love our kids who are maybe wrestling with this personally themselves, or at least at school with friends, with people in their life who think very differently about sexuality than we do. We need help in that area. We need help in how to talk with our neighbor who, a gay couple moves in next door. We need help with navigating the workplace where our company has values that are very different than ours, and thinking about that and thinking about what we can be okay with, what we can't be okay with. So I feel like if we leave people hanging on one of these massive things, then honestly, we're just not doing our jobs as the leaders of the church. So that's why. I mean, I think it's super important, it's super personal, but we brought up of hearing, somebody come talk to you. I mean, I've heard easily a dozen people in our church, even before our series has started on sexuality, saying thank you, saying, my daughter is wrestling with her gender identity. My adult child has walked away from the faith because they believe the church is bigoted towards, LGBTQ people. I've heard just story after story. And to me, that shows that we're hitting a need here.
It's interesting you bring that last one up too, because that one hits close to home for me. We have a good friend who's no longer attending church because she just believes that the church has been so condemning of homosexuality. She doesn't necessarily agree that that's the best way to live your life, but she feels, how can I go to a church where they're condemning people as almost less than human who are living that way? So that's a very real one. But Wyatt, I mean, I think you and I would both have to acknowledge that there is a lot of fear surrounding this issue.
Yeah, not everybody's saying thank you so much for handling this topic. There's a ton of fear, and I would say rightfully so. I think a lot of us have watched the story of a church that, not Alderwood, of churches out there in the community somewhere who's, at one point were very faithful, were, preaching the Bible, believing what the Bible says, carrying out the gospel. And it seems like some of these churches just began a slow drift where it started off by, maybe questioning some not so important things, but then, an issue like sexuality comes around and it's like, well, I mean, we have to love people. Maybe that means that we just accept that this is how they are. And there's this slow fade that eventually ends in a church that really doesn't ever preach the Bible anymore, doesn't care about the gospel, has basically abandoned Orthodox faith entirely. And many of these churches really, either shut their doors or end up being just, a shell of something that used to be a church that isn't even a church anymore. And so I think there's fear anytime these hot button topics come up. Is this happening in my church?
Yeah, what would you say to the person who's afraid that we're on the slippery slope?
Well, first, I would say, and maybe they're hopefully listening right now, I'd say, first, if you have any questions, concerns, I'm your pastor, the other pastors here, we're here for you. Talk to us, please. Come, you can sit in our office. You can have a phone conversation with us. Like, I want to hear your concerns so I can pastor you. So that's the first thing I'd say. But the second thing I'd say, and just in the case that conversation doesn't happen, we are not on any kind of slippery slope. We're not headed a trajectory away from Scripture. In fact, it's quite the opposite. What we're going to do in this series is say, let's actually look at what the Bible really says and then do what we're supposed to do as Christians, which is use the word as a mirror to examine ourselves and say, where are we not lining up with what the Bible is calling us to? Now, I think what might surprise some people at times is, as much as I think the Bible is going to affirm a orthodox, historical, Christian view of sexuality, meaning that sex and gender are created by God for the intent to be expressed in a marriage between a man and a woman that is a permanent bond. I think the Bible is going to clearly come through on that. I also think the Bible is going to challenge significantly some of us who hold those orthodox positions, but have not taken the Bible's radical call to love people with the compassion of Jesus and the grace of Jesus, to be in messy relationships with people who think differently and act differently. I think we haven't let the Bible convict us and challenge us with the idea that, guess what? Jesus was hanging out with prostitutes. He was hanging out with tax collectors. Like, the religious people were the ones who were mad at Jesus because he was hanging out with sinners too much. And so often our churches don't look that way. And I think the Bible is going to be very challenging to us.
Yeah, I think you're right. We have been very clear traditionally on that first part of the message. The Bible is very clear on what marriage is, what sex is for, but we have not let the Bible mess with us. We've not let the Bible convict us. It's like we wanted to use it to convict everyone else, but put ourselves in a different category.
Yeah. And if I can go one step further, I think if I could speak to those people who have some fears right now that we're abandoning the teachings of the Bible. Again, we're not. I also want to remind people that there's other people in our church who have fears right now as well heading into this sexuality series, but they're different kinds of fears. They're the fears of parents with LGBTQ kids in our congregation who are worried that they're going to be at a church service where their pastor is on stage saying things that completely alienate and, condemn and just bring shame on their kids in a way that makes them not want to know Jesus. Like, that's a real fear that's out there. And sadly, I feel like I grew up in a church culture where we accepted being in a church where our position was super clear and gay people did not feel welcomed or loved at our church.
Yep.
We were fine with that. As long as our position was super clear, we were good. And we just kind of felt like it's God's problem to deal with those people. Like, if they're, they feel like we hate them, and if they feel like, they have no place here, and like, not our problem. And what I want to say, it's our problem. It is, Jesus makes it our problem. He calls us to be the salt and light. He calls us to be his hands and feet. It's our job to love people like Jesus loves them. And so we can't accept being a community that makes, people feel like they have no spot in God's kingdom if they're wired a certain way. That's not the gospel,
I really appreciate you speaking to that issue of fear. And I think, in fairness to, our dear friends that are watching and listening, we're approaching this not unlike Paul said to the Corinthians, I came to you in fear and trembling. I mean, we recognize this is a big deal. These are hard topics, but what you pointed out earlier is just so huge. We do believe God's word is sufficient for us. We do believe God is speaking to us still. He has fresh truth, fresh eyes for us to see his consistent, solid word. And so we have confidence in that.
Yeah. So, big picture, the goal heading into this series for our church is to really embody reflecting Jesus as he's described in John chapter 1, that he came full of grace and full of truth. And to not be okay with just one of the two, and also it's not a balance. It's not like, let's have a little bit of grace and a little bit of truth. Full of truth, full of grace, which means we're not going to hide from what the Bible says. We're going to teach it clearly. But we're also never going to accept just being okay with LGBTQ people or people who disagree on this issue not being able to feel the love and compassion and grace of Jesus. We got to care as much about that as we care about being right on the truth piece of it. And I'm excited to be challenged by that as we go into it.
Let's talk more about that.
Well, Steve, as we head into the LGBTQ conversation, I think one thing that might be helpful for people to hear is just some of our journey into this conversation is how we got to the point of believing that this is important for our church to handle. Because I didn't always believe that, actually. I kind of thought this was a side issue, a kind of, not super relevant, not super important. But I've really changed my tune on that. I'd be curious to hear kind of your path towards where we are right now.
I'm not entirely proud of this, but I can't help but think back on this without remembering my childhood when we actually used the word gay as a pejorative.
Right.
Like you called another guy gay. It had nothing to do with sexual orientation. It was just the ultimate put down. We used to play a game in the front yard called Smear the Queer.
I'm sure that's familiar to most people my age or older.
It was horrible.
Yeah.
And so, I remember coming into the 80s, even through, AIDS and how so much that was connected to the homosexual community. That was when I first started realizing there was a lot of condemnation coming from the church towards homosexuals as human beings. But I think nothing's affected me more than in more recent years having friends, dear Christian friends, whose kids have grown up in the church and their kids have come out as gay, and watching that family agonize in the tension, first of all, between, who I thought my family was and how I thought I had raised my children, but also loving this child who I brought into the world and continue to love, just living in that tension, and then seeing the rifts develop in the family between, what does it mean to love this person? One person says, maybe we shouldn't have anything to do with them. And another spouse might say, no, we can't do that. We've got to, it's just so painful to watch people walk through this. It's much more human to me since I know people who've lived through that.
Yeah. I think for a lot of people out there, there is a moment when talking about homosexuality or talking about LGBTQ, anything where it moves from being a topic to a reality, to a person where there's a face now. And, it's so easy to just kind of feel like, oh, this is an easy topic, like believe the Bible, end of story. And then you have somebody in your life who you love deeply. And it doesn't mean you abandon believing the Bible, but it just means it's more complicated suddenly, and I remember for me that was really happening as I was the student ministries pastor here at Alderwood, and began to have students in our youth group who were identifying as homosexual or are having some questions about their gender identity.
Did that catch you off guard? Like, did you see that coming? Were you totally surprised at that?
I can't say I was totally surprised. But it's one thing to know in theory teenagers are struggling with this, and then to actually have friends of mine who are teenagers who are struggling, and parents who I know and love who are trying to figure out how to parent their kid in the best way. And so as I was kind of going through that, I just started to realize that there was a big need in our church to rethink, not necessarily what the Bible teaches. In some aspects, there's a need to make sure we actually are getting our theology right, but more so to rethink our approach, to rethink how we handle these topics. And I remember sitting with kids in like our student leaders, our impact team, and having students who love Jesus and love the Bible come to me and say, one of my friends at school just told me they're gay, and I don't know what to do with this because I feel like, as a Christian, like I'm not supposed to accept them. I'm not supposed to stay friends with them, but they're my friend and I love them and I want to stay friends. And I'm hearing them say that. And I'm like, what on earth? Where are you hearing this?
Yeah.
Why do you feel like being a follower of Jesus means you can't be friends with this person? That is nuts. So I had to start questioning, like, what are we doing as a church?
Yes.
That is making kids in our youth group feel like they're not supposed to be friends with gay people, because it certainly wasn't anything I was saying explicitly out of my mouth. And so it just set me back and said, something is wrong. Like something is so wrong in how we're talking about this.
Bro, I just had somebody in my office yesterday asking that question. And it made me think about this. It was almost like the church has put people who we would call gay or homosexuals in this different category that's almost less than human. Like they're so different from us, I can't even relate to them. It's those people. We're always talking about those people. And what happens is, like with my friends that I was talking to yesterday, they're like, yeah, well, now I'm talking to those people, but they're not those people anymore. They're just people. Like, this is a person made in God's image who has emotions and dreams and thoughts and hopes like I do. I can't just think of them or treat them like those people.
So there's a couple of transitions that I remember. I mean, one of the things that I started listening for and I started to recognize was part of the reason why kids were starting to feel like their faith was compelling them to reject all gay people from their life, which is not representing Jesus at all. Right. But the reason why they felt that way is because you started to listen to what were pastors saying on stage about homosexuality? Well, I started to realize most of what we're saying is kind of talking about there is a gay agenda in our nation. There's a group of people who are out to rewrite the morality of our society, and they are opposed to Christianity, and they are dishonoring God, and they're dangerous. We got to protect our kids from them. They're trying to get into our schools. They're trying to rewrite our curriculum. They're trying to change the Constitution. And I get why there was passion there.
Totally.
There's a good God-honoring desire to uphold morality as a society, as a family, and I get it. But I also get that if that's all you ever hear from the pulpit, what you're being told is there's this kind of nefarious, shadowy group out there that are coming for us. And then you find out that somebody you love is now a part of this group that's been described to you over and over again. And you go, this is one of them. I mean, this is the person who's trying to destroy everything that I care about. And so that was one of the things where it's like, we can't think that we're representing Jesus by just simply warning of the evils of, gay rights activists. Like that's not
totally. Have you ever been in an argument with somebody and they like look you square in the eye and go, you just want to win the argument. You're just trying to win. And I always laugh because I'm like, well, you're not? You're not trying to win the argument? You're just in this for fun? Like, we were pointing out that there were people out there who wanted to change our mind when all along we wanted to change their mind. You didn't stumble on any great, insight here. These are just people who think differently than us.
Yeah. And I think that was like mistake number one. We made it an argument. We made it an issue. It was theory. It was an us and them. And what we forgot is that our job is actually to minister to people, real people who have real stories, and to think that every person who's experiencing same-sex attraction is a part of some evil cohort that is trying to destroy the church is just ridiculous. And yet our rhetoric made it sound like that might be true. So that was one big thing. Then I think we stopped doing that as much as a church. And I mean more than Alderwood. I mean, I think the
capital C church.
Yeah, I think we realized that was a problem. But then there was another one that really got me, which was we would start talking about we need to love gay people. We need to listen to their stories and share Jesus with them. And remember that the gospel is for everyone, which is all positive. But one of the things I recognize is that we almost always would talk about gay people as if they are explicitly outside of our walls.
That is exactly what I was thinking. And I'm still stuck on my little phrase, those people, because I think like the lightning bolt for a lot of Christians, and in your experience and mine, it's happened probably more in the last decade. Those people are sitting right in our church right now, in our youth group, in our Sunday morning congregation. They're here.
Yeah. And I mean, here you start hearing a few stories of people who say, man, I grew up in the church. I've loved Jesus my whole life. You know, I was raised to love Jesus. When I hit puberty, started to realize that I wasn't attracted to the opposite sex like everybody else was. And I had, you know, same-sex attraction, and I prayed that it would go away, and it didn't. And then I started, you know, realizing that in the eyes of my church, my pastor, that makes me somebody who is outside of the family. I mean, you know, like just the fact that I'm experiencing these kind of attractions, it means that I'm not a part of...
I can't belong here.
Yeah. And I mean, you start to hear those stories, and that just breaks your heart. You know, somebody who loves Jesus, who's accepted the gospel, you know, but just the struggle of temptation, our language at times could make them feel like we think that they're not saved.
And let's be clear that we're distinguishing something important here, because let's say we're talking about a teenager like you were talking about within your youth group, and maybe that teenager comes to you and says, you know, I'm really struggling with an alcohol problem or a drug addiction or even pornography and lust. Somehow we kind of treated them like, well, I understand. Yeah, that happens. You know the story of David? Let's talk. But if
you're going to face temptation, keep fighting.
That's just hang in there.
Yep.
But the kid who comes to us with same-sex attraction, you know, suddenly we're freaked out. First, because we didn't know they were sitting here in our midst, and we love them and we know their names. And secondly, because we made it not only those people, but that sin, as if it's the one sin that's outside of normal sin.
Which is so crazy because, I mean, one, sexual sin is sexual sin, you know? Like, you know, the kid comes to you and says, hey, I've been watching pornography for 3 years. And we go, yeah, okay, so glad you told us that. It's right to get it out there. We're going to have some accountability. We love you. Remember the cross. Remember forgiveness. Like, you know, we like that was just like whatever. You know,
everybody struggles.
Yeah,
with
there's like this kind of, well, you're the 50th kid I've talked to.
You're
this
a
year.
normal red-blooded American kid.
Yeah, but for somehow, if it was sexual temptation that was not heterosexual, then you know that just it threw us for a second, and I think that was really damaging. I mean, you know, one of the things that I would love for Alderwood to be is a church where our kids grow up, our teenagers are here, and they know that if this is a struggle for them, if they have temptation that is, you know, homosexual in nature, they just have confidence that when they share that with a leader, with their pastor, that they're going to be loved. No one's going to, you know, be completely shocked into a coma. You know, like that they're not going to be treated as a different category of person now. Like we're going to love them. We're going to walk with them. And most churches have not been that.
When we were recently at Preston's conference, Theology in the Raw, he shared a story. He may share it when he's here. I don't know, but it just stood out to me so much. You know, he started doing his research on this topic, I don't know, 8-9 years ago. And he talked about how he started to move from just the theological, you know, book research. And he's like, I should probably actually go talk to some people who are gay and hear their stories. And he said the first 3 people he talked to were people who had grown up in a church. And the first thing they said to him is, you're the first Christian who has ever spoken kindly to me. Not ever spoken to me, just ever spoken kindly to me. And that just, it honestly haunts me that could be our story in the church. That it should never be that way if we represent Jesus.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, so we're going to have these conversations, and it's not going to be comfortable all the time, and I think it's going to be challenging to us, and, you know, we're not going to agree, by the way, on every fine nuance of these conversations, you know, what labels we use and what labels we don't, and, you know, would you attend the wedding of a gay couple who's not Christians but invite you and they want you in their life? You know, there's complications in this conversation. We're not going to agree. That's okay. We're gonna agree on the essentials of what the Bible teaches, on what the Bible clearly says. We're going to agree on that. But in practice, there's going to be some areas of disagreement. But I want to address some of the biggest hang-ups for us as we get into this conversation. The things that maybe are theological holes that we have that keep us from handling these issues very well, and the things that really maybe trip up a lot of Christians. And so I thought maybe we could head into that in this next section.
So we've talked about some of the hang-ups people might have in terms of how they perceive gay people, some social issues, those people, etc. But what do you think are some of the other hang-ups people have, maybe especially like theologically, the way they view or read their Bibles?
Yeah. Well, so one is, I think we have a really hard time understanding each other in these conversations. I think we use terms and we feel like everybody else knows what those terms mean, and they think that they mean the same thing that we do, and they don't. And so, I mean, I've been a part of conversations many times with Christians where I feel like we actually believe mostly the same thing, but because of the terminology we're using, we have a hard time feeling like we agree.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, okay. So, I mean, one is just, what does homosexuality mean? You know, I wrote a little questionnaire that we've used as a tool in training for students and staff, and the elders and I recently went through it together. It's a quick survey, all multiple choice, just asking you questions about situations and scenarios involving different LGBTQ topics. You know, would you go to a wedding between these people in this situation?
Right.
You know, that kind of stuff. And one of the reasons we use it is because people usually start off by thinking this is such a simple topic. It's not hard or not complex. And what almost everybody who takes this quiz realizes is, okay, it's a little bit more complicated than I thought it was. And Toby will help us by putting the quiz in the show notes. So if you want to take it and you're listening to this, go ahead and click on that link and fill it out, and let us know what you thought of it. Let us know where your answers came down. But one of the questions is just simply this: is homosexuality a sin? And every Bible-believing conservative Christian has been trained to just go, okay, obviously I know the answer to this one. Yes, homosexuality is a sin. Clearly the Bible teaches it. It's what my pastor's been telling me forever. And even that question, so simple, is actually way more complicated than people think it is, because you have to ask the question, what is homosexuality? What is it? And for many people, they think the definition of homosexuality is pursuing sexual relationships with people who are of the same sex as you. So if somebody says they're gay, what that means is that they are seeking a gay relationship, they're seeking a gay marriage. And part of the reason why people think it means that is because it's been used that way.
Right.
You know, so I'm not saying that people are just flat out wrong when they think that.
I'm not going to lie. I was sitting here saying, duh, Wyatt. We do know what the term means.
Okay, but here's the problem. That's not what that term means to many people. And in fact, if you actually just look the term homosexuality up in the dictionary, you're going to get a slightly different version of it. So I have Merriam-Webster in front of me, but you can use any dictionary, really. I mean, go ahead at home and you know, prove me on this one. Here's what Merriam-Webster says the definition of homosexuality is. It says, sexual or romantic attraction to others of one's same sex. And what's important to note about that is that says nothing about whether somebody is actually pursuing a sexual relationship or a lifestyle of any kind or any of that. It's speaking purely to attraction. And what that means is that somebody might use that term to describe themselves, even if they completely embrace Jesus' sexual ethic. You know, they know that same-sex relationships are wrong. They don't want to be in a gay marriage. They want to honor Jesus with their sexuality. Maybe they're celibate. You know, maybe they are open one day to marrying somebody of the opposite sex if God, you know, leads them that direction. But like, they're 100% in on Jesus' ethic, but they might use the term gay to describe themselves. And what they mean is that they experience attraction to people of the same sex, and they're just being honest about that.
So you're saying the term does not necessarily include the behavior. A lot of people use it just to refer to the desire or the attraction.
Yeah. I'm saying absolutely. The term is used not to refer to behavior. It can be. Many people who identify as gay are completely embracing behavior. You know, like. But what I'm saying is that that's not what it means to everybody. And this is why it's. And again, like, even in the Merriam-Webster's definition does not include being in a sexual relationship. You know, one way to think of it is the corollary. You know, I've only ever experienced attraction to the opposite sex. I've considered myself to be straight my entire life. I was straight when I wasn't dating anybody. I was straight when I wasn't looking for a girlfriend. I was straight before I got married. I'm straight after I got married. I'm straight when I'm sleeping. I'm straight when I'm awake. Like it's not referring to behavior. It's referring to a set of attractions.
So I think what I'm hearing you say is that it's not necessarily the case that when someone refers to themselves or to homosexual behavior as okay, that we're going to agree with that, but we should help the person, whoever we're having a conversation with, define their terms. What do you mean when you say homosexual?
Okay, and that's the thing right there. And this is my pastoral word to people who engage in this conversation. Somebody asks you, is homosexuality wrong? The first question you should ask is, what do you mean?
Okay.
What do you mean? Let's talk about what you mean by the terms. Let's ask questions. Let's not just assume that we know what they mean or what their intent is. So that's one thing is there's so much talking past each other that happens in this conversation by just not getting the terms, not agreeing to what the terms mean. And this is one of the other important things to remember about terms is that you don't get to define terms. The way language works is that terms are, used in our society, in our culture.
There's a democratic process involved around terms.
And they change.
Yeah.
Which means like the experience of what gay meant 30 years ago doesn't necessarily define how it's used and what it means today. English is a living language that shifts and usage changes and all that kind of stuff. So that makes it a very complicated conversation.
So the hang up or the problem can come here then when we're constantly condemning homosexual behavior or just homosexuality, and someone's sitting there in our Sunday morning, gathering thinking, well, I just struggle with being attracted to. I'm not acting it out.
So now you're onto it, okay? Because you stand in the pulpit and you say, what you need to know is that homosexuality is sin. It is a sin from the pit of hell, needs to be repented of. And you unintentionally are completely destroying somebody in your congregation who is completely committed to Jesus, wants to honor Jesus with their whole life, but has attractions that they can't shake. And you're making them feel like they personally, as a human being, are an abomination to God. And yet, I think what we would hope to communicate to that person is that, man, if you're striving to honor Jesus and to give him all of yourself, your identity is found in Jesus, you are rejecting sin, rejecting lust, like all those things, like, man, keep up the good work, stay the course, follow Jesus, but you're unintentionally, because of the language difference, making them feel like you think they're, completely in the wrong. So it's complicated. So
that's kind of a language hang up. And I think you make a great point. I mean, it reminds me, you and I were talking about this earlier, the very important scripture that comes from James where, we're encouraged to be quick to listen and slow to speak. And that certainly applies here. I'm thinking of another kind of a hang up for people who have grown up in the church with the Bible. And I think, if you look up the term homosexuality in your concordance, depending on what version you have, you really don't find that word. To your point here, like the technical Greek word in passages like Timothy, where it's translated in the NIV homosexual, is actually male betters.
Yeah, I forget.
I forget
It's a compound word, and it just is a compound word of male and bed.
And clearly that is focusing on the behavior. There's no nuance there for same-sex attraction. This is actual behavior.
Correct.
So, I mean, Preston, I think, is going to get into some of this with us. For me, though, it's been more of an issue. The way I was, taught this issue from the Bible is like, not only is this a sin, it's like the worst sin. Like if you go into the Roman Catholic categories or the ancient, more Orthodox categories of mortal and venial sins, and it's almost like, and then homosexuality. Like,
it's really bad.
It's the worst, which is why we got to those people.
Well, and I do find it convenient that most people define really bad sins as sins that they don't struggle with. So there's one thing to contribute to the conversation.
There is that part. There's also just looking carefully at what the text says. I mean, I'll focus, I think we could tackle this from a lot of different angles, and we're not going to get into a bunch of textual, work here, but I was often taught homosexuality is an egregious sin because the Bible calls it an abomination. An abomination. Well, that word just strikes terror into your heart when you hear it, abomination. And a couple of years ago, I was thinking about that, and I just got out my, trusty computer concordance, and I was like, I don't remember that. So I'm going to look up the word abomination. What is that the only sin that's an abomination? There's like 45 sins in the Bible that are called abomination. One of them is using scales in the market that have been tampered with. That's an abomination to God, to lie to people and cheat people by tampering with the scales. I mean, there's all kinds of things.
I mean, the Old Testament, like the Levitical law, I mean, there's things as simple as like, wearing clothing of mixed cloths. That's an abomination, so it's not quite as clear that abomination just automatically means this is one of the worst possible sins. So I think that's important for people to recognize.
Very, very important. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier, that we not only in our minds create this category of those people, but that sin, as if that sin is, to your point a minute ago, completely foreign to normal human beings, and I'm a normal human being, so I can't even imagine that.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I would try to pastor people as you think about, sins being worse than others. One, yes, certain sins are worse than others.
Absolutely.
That is actually true. Jesus himself teaches that, as he says that, Pilate is guilty of a sin, but it's actually the religious leaders of the Jews that are guilty of the greater sin. So Jesus has gradations of sin in mind in that. But in general, I just would pastor people, man, be more heartbroken over your own sin than anybody else's. Like, don't get too hung up on grading other people's levels of sinfulness. Like, let's be humble enough to look at ourselves in that. The last hang up that I want to address here is just one of the things you have to understand to be able to talk about some of the nuance in this conversation is we need to have a good theology of temptation. And I think we miss that. And so, I mean, for some people, they probably have heard us talk about how we want to have compassion for the person who's experiencing same-sex attraction. And it wouldn't surprise me if there's people who are kind of recoiling about that by saying, well, but that's sin. Like,
you're condoning sin.
God didn't design us to be attracted to the same sex. Like, that's sin that needs to be repented of and mortified and put to death. And like, you can't let somebody exist in a state of being attracted to the same sex. That's where I really just want to take a step back and say, we need to remember that there is such a thing called temptation, which is the opportunity to sin, or even the desire for something that would be sinful if it was fulfilled. And yet, strangely to some people, it's very clear biblically that temptation itself is not sin. And here, just real quickly, the way we know that biblically, a few reasons. I mean, one, when we get introduced to the concept of sin, one of the things we are introduced to very early in the Bible is the idea that Adam and Eve were tempted in the garden before they sinned. So temptation comes before sin. They also were tempted. They didn't have a sin nature. So temptation isn't just a product of having a sin nature, because Adam and Eve didn't have it and they were tempted. And the idea of temptation is actually that you have the opportunity to resist it and to not sin. So Adam and Eve show us that. And it's also a pattern that's shown to us in Jesus. Jesus is tempted in the wilderness for 40 days, and yet he was without sin. And the author of Hebrews is the one who makes this super clear for us. And I think it's a super helpful passage on temptation. Hebrews Chapter 4, verse 15 says, "For we do not have a high priest," talking about Jesus, "who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin." So Hebrews very clearly telling us Jesus was without sin, and yet he was tempted in every way, just as we are. And so we have to understand that category, that you can be tempted to do a lot of things. Doesn't mean that you're in sin unless you give in to that temptation. Now, giving in to temptation can mean more than just an action. Like lust is sin, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to actually act on a temptation physically to be in sin, but temptation itself is not sin, or else Jesus sinned. That's what Hebrews is saying.
So what I think I hear you saying, Wyatt, is that someone could be a homosexual in the sense that is their struggle. That is their temptation. They are attracted to people of the same sex and be a Christ follower.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If we believe that temptation is sin, we're going to condemn people who are actually walking in righteousness. Righteousness is rejecting temptation and choosing to rightly walk with God. If the bar is don't be tempted, then we're setting a bar that even Jesus didn't cross. So, I mean, we can't hold people to a higher standard than Jesus.
That's profound. It really is. And I think as you've walked the staff through this, and you and I have talked a lot about it, we've talked as an elder board about it, I think to get to the point where we can see that is really an important place for our congregation to be.
Yeah. Well, see, we've covered a lot of ground in this one. And where do you want to leave people as we end this conversation and look ahead to the series and having Preston Sprinkle out?
As I've thought about, as we've had the aforementioned conversations, as I've done some reading, and most of all, as I just look at the life of Jesus, I think the thing that jumps out to me is we talk often about the fact that Jesus spent his time with broken people. He was often accused of, hanging around with the sinners, the tax collectors, the drunks, the prostitutes, which is to say, not just that Jesus hung out with sinners, Jesus hung out with the people that society had condemned as those people.
Yeah.
The people that other people were saying, I'm not like those people. They're beneath me. I could never be that person. Those are the people in the first century that Jesus hung out with. If Jesus were here today, who are the people Jesus would hang out with?
Amen. And we want to be there. We want to be where Jesus would be. So, yeah, thanks, bro.
Thanks for leading this conversation. We really appreciate that you have joined us for all kinds of conversations here on Native Exiles. Some fun conversations, some challenging conversations, and like today, a really tough conversation. We appreciate so much that you're a part of the conversation. Please continue to follow and subscribe to our podcast. And as always, look forward to seeing you next time on Native Exiles.